Peter Collier, author of The Roosevelts, an American Saga. In the middle of your book is a story about Elliott Roosevelt and FDR and an oil man and a loan and on and on. Do you remember that story?
Well, I do actually. It occurred in 1939. President Roosevelt was fielding all the world's problems at that time, trying to maneuver the United States into the European conflict, trying to still be, as he put it, Dr. New Deal at the same time. And probably his most intractable problem, probably for all his life, was his own children. These were the children of a basically, as I'm sure your viewers know, loveless relationship with Eleanor, although it was a tremendous partnership. And here you see, actually, the four sons of Eleanor Roosevelt.
Which one of those is Elliott?
Elliott is the one second from the right. And he was probably the most attractive, charismatic of the boys in a certain way. I think he was the one who most resented, really, and most voiced the resentment of his generation for his parents. It was a quite remarkable story, actually, that generation really spent its life complaining about its parents, Eleanor and Franklin, obsessed with the coldness that they had exhibited toward them, obsessed with the fact that they had not gotten the kind of spiritual and emotional nourishment that they expected. And indeed, this generation would be quite uncharacteristically Roosevelt in that it would have among the five members, the children of Franklin and Eleanor, they would have 19 marriages. They would have 2 spouses commit suicide. Particularly flamboyant, I think, in the 30s and 40s and 50s, although perhaps not so surprising today. Nonetheless, in 1939, Elliott was a grown man. He was living in Texas, sniping at his father, actually, on the fringes of the New Deal, kind of captivated by Texas oilmen and their spokesman, and they were very conservative and very much opposed to FDR, and at the same time he was a mouthpiece for these conservatives, attacking his father periodically. He was asking for help, as always, and in this particular instance that you refer to, called him in the Oval Office and asked him to talk to a department store magnate that he had convinced to loan him $200,000 for one of his business ventures. As he later said, Elliott later said, "I always wanted to be a big man." That was the only way I could really justify myself inside the Roosevelt tradition. And of course, Franklin got on the phone, as he always did with Elliott and the other boys, and with that sense he had, I think Eleanor had it as well, that they had, because of this peculiar relationship between the parents, this partnership that he had evolved out of this loveless relationship, that they kind of had let these kids down. So he was always guilty and always stood up and did what Elliott asked him. And when Elliott asked him to call this man, this department store magnate, and kind of say that, yeah, it would be a good idea to loan him this money, of course, Franklin got right on the phone and did it. And this is kind of indicative of the kind of relationship that they had.
Now, when did you find that out, or when did we as a country find out that this kind of a deal had been made?
Oh, I think it actually had been known. I think that the story, this book I've written is the story of the arc, really, of the Roosevelt family in America. And it's a remarkable story because, of course, it begins with probably the most clannish tribal family, not in the kind of narrow and semi-neurotic way, say, the Kennedys have taken that kind of tribalness to an extreme, but tribal in the sense of just a tremendous closeness in this Dutch-American family. This arc that begins with one great man, Theodore Roosevelt, stepping inside history, not just deciding to live with history the way most of us do, but stepping inside it, kind of trying to bottle the lightning of history, as it were. That story that begins there actually completes itself in the generation of Franklin and Eleanor's children, when these children really kind of, the last of whom died, Jimmy, Franklin's eldest son, the last of whom died about 4 years ago. They really kind of complete this arc by kind of selling out the family, selling the family. I mean, they're so angry, so filled with a vendetta against Franklin and Eleanor. They sell every scrap of privacy, every scrap of private information, writing bitter memoirs, giving bitter interviews. And it kind of completes this, in a way, tragic arc that defines the Roosevelt family.
If the Roosevelts, either one of them, Theodore Roosevelt or Franklin Roosevelt, lived today in this world that we have, the media world, what would happen?
Well, I suppose that they would be relentlessly picked at. Their foibles, their peccadillos would be relentlessly, I mean, you know, the press is in a certain way, you know, kind of like the flock of chickens that finds some sort of wound on one of its members and then pecks it until it bleeds. I'm sure that they would make the Roosevelts bleed. I think that Franklin probably would have been particularly vulnerable because he was, you know, like John F. Kennedy, he was tremendously protected by the press in his own day. He was, as your viewers know, generally photographed from the waist up. Was considered bad taste to allude, even visually or through imagery, to his paralysis. And I think there was a lot that went on in his private life, certainly, ranging from the fairly well-known affair with Lucy Mercer Rutherford that had taken place in 1918 and had been the storm that finally levered him and Eleanor apart. That was known and never reported. And his kind of flirtatious behavior with other of the women Eleanor bitterly referred to as his blondes, that was fairly well known and never reported. So I think by today's standards he would probably be fair game. I think that Theodore, on the other hand, was virtually really invulnerable. I mean, he had a fairly impeccable private life, and in fact he was a fascinating object for the press in his own day. Theodore Roosevelt really came along, I think, and part of the story that I tell here is really about his family, the first family with really, you know, boisterous young children to inhabit the White House, the first family that was clearly a nuclear family in a time when America was shifting from being the extended family of the frontier and the plains to the nuclear family of the big cities. This was a nuclear family living in the White House, and he came along at a time when the press really had come of age in America. There were wire services, so that details of his intimate doings and those of his really charming children, all of whom were major figures in the American imagination at the turn of the century, could be reported to every hinterland in America. And the press was obsessed with Theodore Roosevelt, and it followed him very closely, and because he was really in his own time a larger-than-life character. I mean, our own time perhaps sees him as a character and is just beginning once again after this kind of vapid revisionism of the 60s, which dismissed him as a sort of jingoist, that sort of thing, beginning to see him not only as a great character, but a great man.
You've done the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Kennedys, and the Fondas?
Yeah.
When did you start this series?
Well, I started actually becoming interested in great American families in the early 70s. Great American families in the sense of power or prestige. Families that were kind of under a high-intensity microscope, as it were, which enlarged those features that exist in all of our families. The kind of internal drama where there are generational linkages made and broken, where there are inheritances, as it were, picked up and fumbled, where there is love offered and betrayed.
Which was the first one?
The first one was the Rockefellers, and actually I was the editor of a magazine, a radical magazine, called Ramparts in the late 60s, early 70s, and this magazine, as most radical publications, ran at a significant deficit and had to raise money to keep going, and we found that one of the best ways to raise money was through the Rockefeller kids. They're not kids anymore. They're the children of Nelson and David and Lawrence John D. III. That is this remarkable group of brothers that burst on the American scene in the 20s and 30s and captivated the country. And you know, we were raising money from their children to write these articles and exposés attacking their parents, that is, Nelson and David particularly, as kind of executive committee of the ruling class, you know, all the Marxist cliches of the era. And it occurred to me, this is really a good story. Here, the kids, these Rockefeller kids, were subsidizing a magazine that was devoting a substantial amount of time to blackguarding their parents. And so I kind of got into this business of generational stories and dynastic biographies, if you want to call it that, through this interest.
J. Rockefeller, the senator from West Virginia, is the son of which?
John D. III. So he's actually John D. IV. So he's got the famous name, stretching back to his great-grandfather's era. That is the first John D. Rockefeller. He actually told me something very interesting when I interviewed him back in, gee, it would have been 73, 74. He wasn't a senator then. He was president of a small college in West Virginia. And during our interview, he kind of, as with most Rockefellers, very kind of discreet and hedging. And he said to me finally, he said, you know, there are good books about the Rockefellers and there are bad books about the Rockefellers. But the best books about the Rockefellers are the ones that don't get written. Meaning, of course, that, you know, this family was very anxious to kind of protect its inner sanctum. And it clued me into the fact that that's what a good biographer had to do, in a sense, was write the books that don't get written. That would have that kind of authenticity, that would penetrate this veil, in a sense, that would inhabit that inner sanctum and see what the inner dynamics of the family life were all about.
Where do you live?
California.
How long have you lived there?
All my life, actually.
What city?
I live now in a small city in what is called the California Gold Country. It's where gold was discovered, called Nevada City. One of the great towns of America, I might say.
And where did you go to school?
Berkeley, UC Berkeley, during the Troubles.
What years?
I was there actually from 58 to, well, into the 60s as a kind of one of the walking wounded graduate students that keeps taking courses and never gets the thesis done.
When was Ramparts magazine on the market?
Actually, Ramparts, I think, really began in about '64 as a liberal Catholic quarterly, a magazine of the Catholic laity. And by '66, '67 had shed that identity and become the kind of inner office memorandum of the New Left. And I think it will deserve an agate-type footnote in the history of journalism to come, actually, if nothing more, for kind of midwifing the rebirth of investigative journalism in this country with its exposés of the CIA and that sort of thing. I think that it became obsolete quickly as publications like the Times and the Post saw that investigative journalism was kind of the wave of the future, and that is that they had to, particularly after the famous fiasco of the Bay of Pigs, where the Times knew about it in advance and withheld information, they had to take a more oppositional stance to government. But Ramparts kind of ran out of gas, as did the radical movement, and disappeared, thank God, in the early 70s.
What did you study at Berkeley?
I studied English literature.
What was your family like?
My own family?
No, your mother and father and that environment.
Oh, these were people who had come to California in the 30s from disparate places in the country. My father from South Dakota, my mother from Alabama. Kind of, I think it would be correct to say, in search of the American dream that wasn't available to them because of, you know, kind of their class origins, so to speak. The fact that they felt pigeonholed in the hopelessness of their situation. And they'd come there in the 30s and made a life for themselves, and a good life. And they were thankful. They were thankful for it. My mother had a succession of part-time jobs, mainly to get out of the house. My father was an insurance agent.
Did you have a family of brothers and sisters?
One sister.
She out there?
She's out there.
Are you married? You have children?
I am.
How many kids?
I'm married. I have 3 kids, and you know, I suppose, I mean, one of the upshots of having done these books, I don't know if it's a cause or an effect, actually, is you know, an appreciation of family, particularly in our own time when families are endangered species. I appreciate the ties, the kind of thick loyalties, the tragedies. I mean, every family, and these families particularly that I've written about, have victors and victims. This is, of course, the psychological toll that families sometimes take on people. Is what has led, you know, heedless and thoughtless and ultimately irresponsible critics to criticize American families.
There's a building over on the other side of the Capitol called the Longworth Building. and it has something to do with this lady right here. Who is this?
You're seeing the picture of Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the eldest daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, who actually was, outside of Theodore, I suppose, the most famous person in the country at the turn of the century, as Theodore, and during Theodore's presidency. She was called Princess Alice by the press. She was as interesting to the press in a way as Theodore, and by the way, I didn't get to finish saying something about Theodore in the press that's very interesting. Theodore Roosevelt, of course, left the presidency in 1908 and lived till 1919. And from the day he left the presidency until the day he died, there was a kind of a pool person, as it were, a member of the press stationed in Oyster Bay, where he lived, that got up every day and kind of sat around the telegraph office there, waiting to transmit news of what Theodore ate, said, thought, felt, experienced. He continued to have this magnetic hold on the American imagination, so that he had his own personal, as it were, reporter assigned to him until the day he died. And you know, he's one of these men. Somebody said once, you come away from him, you know, feeling after you've been with him, the intensity is such that you feel that you've got him. He's gotten into your hair and into your clothes. He's saturated your life. And another person, William Allen White, the famous newspaper man, once said, trying to explain the effect Theodore Roosevelt had had on him, he said, when I was a young man, Theodore Roosevelt bit me and I went mad. So it's an extraordinary sort of story. And part of the story is Alice, his daughter. She really, she had this long kind of antagonism actually with her cousin, Eleanor. They had certain similarities in a way. Alice was the daughter of Theodore by his first wife, who died tragically when he was a young man, 24 years old or so. She died right after Alice Longworth, or Alice Roosevelt, was born. Hours later, Theodore came home to see his new daughter. He was a young, promising Republican legislator in the New York State Assembly. He came rushing home to see the birth of his daughter, and saw his daughter, but saw also his first wife dying, and she died in his arms a few hours later. Became part of that remarkable kind of epic of self-creation, which is Theodore Roosevelt, which began really when he was a young man, doomy young boy, 8 or 9 years old, so sick from asthma that his parents feared he might die. And at one point his father came to him in a fairly famous story and said, you know, knowing that he had this charisma and magnetism, and that he needed a kind of vessel to contain this luminous intelligence, that you must make your body. You have the intelligence, but you must make your body. In other words, you must make this container that will allow you to survive. And Theodore manfully started working out on this gymnasium and creating himself. And this process of self-creation kept going and going. Right after his wife died and Alice was born, for instance, he was so heartbroken, he just kind of threw up everything and left for the Badlands of South Dakota, in a fairly famous, South and North Dakota, in a fairly famous episode, and became a cowboy. And really went there thinking he might just kind of live whatever life was left over to him, but actually found in that American frontier the strength to go on, the strength to feel that he could survive and indeed not only endure but prevail, to use Faulkner's words, among these rough-hewn American frontiersmen.
How did Alice Roosevelt become a Longworth?
Well, she was Princess Alice. She was the most eligible woman in America. She had people following her doings, her quick wit, her biting wit. She was the only person who would take her father on, probably in the country. And she did it quite well and quite successfully, and kind of beat him to a standoff, and developed this mordant wit. And she was paired in the public imagination with every eligible crowned head of Europe, actually. They had her marrying royalty, but she finally found, after kind of a long period of eligibility, she found herself marrying this squat, sort of charismatic but not particularly handsome congressman from Ohio named Nicholas Longworth, who was a kind of powerful figure in the House. And it was fairly clear, and should be clear from the picture you just flashed there, that he has a kind of strong resemblance physically to her father, and people at the time noted that. And They had a kind of vexed relationship which paralleled that of Franklin and Eleanor, although it was it had less depth to it, obviously, less depth of field. And because Nicholas Longworth was a very famous womanizer, you know, Alice would come home and in one particular case found that he had been in flagrante, shall we say, in their own bedroom, and she knew the woman, a society dame, and she wrote her something to the effect, a bitter letter about, "I found your hairpins in my bed," and this woman wrote her back, Sissy Patterson it was, wrote her back a letter saying, "Yeah, and if you look hard, you'll find my underwear up on the chandelier." So it was a kind of, you know, kind of their relationship was carried on at that level. And he was such a famous womanizer, actually, Nicholas Longworth, that he became Speaker of the House and had a lot of enemies in the House. And one particular congressman, knowing his reputation for being a philanderer, thought to kind of have the best of him one day and came up to him as he was sitting at the Speaker's desk and said sneeringly, looking at his bald head, "You know, your head looks like my wife's behind." Nicholas kind of looked up at him, everybody kind of waiting for his answer, and kind of rubbed his head and said, "Yeah, you know, it kind of feels like your wife's behind too." And that was kind of his way of dealing with these rumors, which was to kind of say, yeah.
When did all this become public? I mean, how many years after the actual event and where did it begin popping up in the public media?
This sort of thing, you know, you really as a biographer, you're kind of, in a sense, one part 1940s detective with your speed graphics camera up over the transom, catching people in various revealing states in the next room. You're also kind of one part, I suppose, paramedic, as it were, kind of doing artificial respiration on people who have disappeared from the scene. And in this case, really much of the story in this book is about the children of Theodore Roosevelt, aside from Alice, Alice, but also including the famous boys who were very, very important figures in their own day. Theodore Jr., Kermit, Archibald Roosevelt. These were major figures in their own day and have kind of, in a sense, disappeared from the public consciousness. You know, they were elbowed out of the way in the really significant drama of this family, which was a kind of almost Homeric civil war between the two branches that erupted after Theodore's death. That is, the Oyster Bay branch, his own children, and the Hyde Park branch, the family of Franklin Roosevelt, and Theodore's beloved niece, Eleanor, who was the daughter of his much-loved brother, Elliot, who had been really, you know, there are many little dramas, mini-dramas. This large story of the Roosevelts is a series of vignettes, as it were. And Elliot Roosevelt, Theodore's brother, had been considered more promising when the two of them were young, but as Theodore got his body, got his health, he really outstripped Elliot so significantly that Elliot kind of wilted in his shadow, became a drunk, self-destructive, and died early, leaving this remarkable, physically unattractive but emotionally expansive young woman, Eleanor, behind, an 8- or 9-year-old who was passed around then like a bad penny from aunt to aunt inside that Oyster Bay family, and finally married this pampered only child of the Roosevelt family that had moved up into the Hudson River Valley there in Hyde Park.
What numbered cousin was Eleanor of her husband, Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
They were 5th cousins. And interestingly enough, they were not the only 5th Roosevelt cousins to be married in their generation. There were 2 other 5th cousin marriages. And I suppose what this suggests, if you were querying a Roosevelt of that era about it, they would say, well, who else was there? I mean, that's the story of this family, that, you know, there were, in a sense, only Roosevelts. This was a huge, you know, clan of Dutch Americans that were intensely involved with each other, almost obsessively involved with each other, and obsessively close. And the story, as I said, really the drama of this family is it's coming apart at the seams and dividing into 2 warring factions during the 20s and 30s as his power struggle to harness this kind of legacy of Theodore Roosevelt that hung like a charge of static electricity over American politics at the end of his life after he had died, who was going to be the next Roosevelt? There was no question at that time there would be another Roosevelt. Who was it going to be?
Some other little connections. Joseph and Stuart Alsop who were they, and what was their connection to the Roosevelt family?
Well, Joseph and Stuart Alsop were, probably the most prominent kind of political commentators, I think, of their generation, and particularly in Washington in the 50s and 60s. And they were the grandsons of Theodore Roosevelt's sister, Corinne. They were the sons of her daughter. So they were Roosevelt's by blood, in a sense, and which accounts for the fact that Joseph Alsop particularly was so close to Franklin Roosevelt and his legacy.
The current governor of Massachusetts, William Weld, has a wife who's a Roosevelt?
Right. Actually, there's an interesting situation. One of the FDR heirs, Mark Roosevelt, is running as a Democrat for governor against Governor Weld, whose wife is the great-granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt.
Had any book like this been done before?
No. No book that had really, there were certain things that had never been done. For instance, the man named John Gable, who is the head of the Theodore Roosevelt Association, who I would argue knows more about the Roosevelt family than anybody in the country, said of this book, well, this is the rest of the story. After he read it, that was his response. And I think that's probably right. It's the story, everybody, of course, knows the story of Theodore Roosevelt. It's become, almost a kind of myth. And like a myth, it bears retelling over and over again because it's always interesting. And the same is quite true with Eleanor and Franklin. That story, I think, is yet to be done of the most interesting marriage in American history. And people who inhabited this kind of dark undergrowth of hidden, denied, suppressed emotion filled with a kind of suppressed and oppressed love, and also a kind of anxiety and despair about each other, and a feeling, that they could never kind of have their lives dovetail. That marriage has been written about, notably by Joseph Lash, but I think it still bears constant re-examination as we change as a society. It's a kind of constant that, in a way, defines us by what we say about it. But what had never been done before is following out the kind of arc of this entire family, seeing what happened to the children of Theodore Roosevelt, for instance. They come home from the war. All four of his boys immediately enlisted. Theodore actually tried to get into the war himself, even though he was an old man. He insisted on, first of all, he wanted the United States in that war immediately, not only because of this, what some of his critics then and now would call this obsessive desire for action, but also because he had been a warrior himself at San Juan Hill. He knew battle, he knew what it did to define, men and nations, and he also had a very strong political sense of what the U.S. interests were and what the interests of the world were in kind of stopping that conflict in Europe. So he tried to get in, and of course Wilson had denied him the right to go to Europe and sacrifice himself as he wanted to at the head of a volunteer regiment like the one he had raised to go up San Juan Hill. But he sent his four kids, his four boys, one of whom, perhaps his favorite child, Quentin Roosevelt, whose very poignant love story with Flora Whitney, a kind of Capulet and Montague story, I guess you could say, because of Theodore Roosevelt's well-known distaste for those he called malefactors of great wealth, that is, the plutocrats, whom he really despised because they had done, he felt, nothing with their lives. And he initially felt that way about the Whitney family, but he came to admire them in a way, particularly Gertrude Whitney, the mother of Flora Whitney, who had started this museum and that sort of thing. Anyway, I was able to kind of chronicle this love story between these two people. It was perfectly, a perfect kind of metaphor for what war does to people, how it blights their hopes and that sort of thing. Quentin actually was his son that was lost in the war. He was lost in a dogfight over France after shooting down a German airplane, and the other three boys came home, you know, war heroes. And Theodore Jr. came home ready, really, to seize the legacy of his father and to move toward the White House, to become the next Roosevelt. And he assumed, actually, that he would have a good shot at it. But there was this other Roosevelt in the way, and that was Franklin, who had spent the war at home as Assistant Secretary of Navy under the Wilson administration. An act Theodore Roosevelt Jr. always thought of treachery, but in fact, Franklin had always wanted to be, in a way, the surrogate son of Theodore, and had fed him private information from this listening post inside the Navy Department during the war as a kind of mole. He too felt, actually, that the Wilson administration was dragging its feet. So the stage was really set in 1920 for this contest between Theodore Jr. and Franklin.
When you go to the Normandy Cemetery, you find a Theodore Roosevelt Jr. buried there, and is that the same one? Is this picture right here?
It is. I mean, what happened, to make the long story short, was that Eleanor and Franklin really each at this point, that affair with Lucy Mercer having ended any kind of husband and wife, shall we say, relationship between them, had perfected a kind of the beginning of a partnership, a political partnership, and both for their own reasons saw that Theodore's ambitions, Theodore Jr., had to be beaten back. At this point, when he finally made his run for the governorship of New York in 1924, which, you know, was for him, as he figured, would be a stepping stone to the presidency, as it had been for his father, Franklin was really on the shelf, suffering the after effects of polio. It wasn't really clear that he would ever become a political factor again. And Eleanor, in a most uncharacteristic gesture, set out to really destroy the political hopes of her cousin Theodore Jr. And as he went around the state of New York campaigning, she followed him. She had a car made with a papier-mâché bonnet in the shape of a teapot. And in order to kind of associate him with the scandal of Teapot Dome, she just dogged him all over the state of New York. And every place he spoke, she showed up with this teapot-shaped car, spouting steam, and she would speak afterwards with some of her lady friends, indicating that she felt this was not a chip off the old block, that he was an immature and easily used man. And it was really a sort of baptism into politics for her. And it was also a subject that she was always embarrassed about it forever after. She could never explain satisfactorily to anybody else, least of all to herself, why she had stepped forward, this shy, retiring woman, you know, who had been oppressed by her mother-in-law, who had been a semi-orphan but dependent on the kindness of strangers all her life, had stepped up and really smacked her cousin so viciously. And she said it was a rough act. It was something she never really understood.
Let me ask you some quick questions and little details so we can get the scenario. Mm-hmm. Hyde Park is located where?
Hyde Park is located in upstate New York in the Hudson River area.
About how far from New York City?
Oh, let's see, as a Californian, I would have to say 3 hours by train. That's all I know.
Have you been there?
I have, actually.
And who lived there? Whose estate was it originally?
It was originally the estate of Franklin D. Roosevelt's father, James Roosevelt, who was from a kind of collateral branch with common great-great-grandfathers to that of the Theodore branch, and very close, actually, to the Theodore branch, which had settled in the Long Island area of Oyster Bay. And
how far, and what is Oyster Bay?
Oyster Bay is just an area there on the Long Island, on the Sound of Long Island, I guess you'd say.
How far is it from New York City?
I guess it's maybe an hour and a half.
And if you go to both of these places today, what can you see there?
Well, if you go to Hyde Park, you can see the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library, which is, I think, fairly exceptional, and you can see the house where he was born and where, as as a very solitary only child of a tyrannical mother, whom Alice Longworth called in her own inimitable fashion a domineering Tartar. You can see where this young boy lived and where he grew up, and you can see the actual house that he inhabited as a mature man when he came back to visit his mother and used it as a sort of retreat, outfitted in, with ramps, early kind of independent living type situation, I guess you'd say. And I find it a really an interesting sort of library and shrine and one thing another, but it doesn't really convey, of course, the sort of life. I mean, I would urge your viewers, obviously, if they want to see something that will body forth a whole idea of how a family and how a man lived, to go to Sagamore Hill, which is the Theodore Roosevelt family estate, which is now a national monument, national park, I guess, actually, on Long Island there. And really, the house has been recently rehabilitated, but it's been really rehabilitated back to pretty much precisely what it was when this remarkable family with 5 children lived there. 6 children, actually, lived there. And you know, all the pets are buried there in the pet cemetery, each with their own name, including the horse that Theodore rode to glory on San Juan Hill.
The different sides. The Theodore Roosevelt side, he was married how many times?
Twice.
How many children total did he have?
It's 6.
How many of them married?
Well, they all married, actually. He had 2 daughters, Alice and Ethel, and 4 sons. And they all married except Quentin, who was really on the verge of marriage, had been engaged to Flora Whitney, and then died in aerial combat before he got a chance to marry her.
How many of those ever ran for political office?
Well, only Theodore Jr. ever ran for political office, really. People often said that Alice would have made a great president, which she probably would have in a sense. But Theodore Jr. Really followed his father's footsteps, and he ran for the assembly in New York and was elected overwhelmingly, became a kind of maverick assemblyman the way his father had been, became assistant secretary of the Navy as his father and Franklin had been. It was almost like a Roosevelt family sinecure, and then in 1924 made the decision to run against Al Smith for the governorship of New York, to take the bit in his teeth and to go for it.
On the FDR side, how many children how many times did he be married?
He was married only once.
How many children did he have?
He had 5 children.
And how many of them got divorced?
Well, they all got divorced in multiples. I think, let's see, his son John only had 2 marriages. The rest had from 3 to 5. Franklin Jr. and Elliot both had 5 marriages.
And you mentioned earlier that there were suicides in this.
There were suicides of spouses. The Roosevelt, that Roosevelt family was a tough act to be in, not because of the demanding sort of moral imperatives the way it was in the Theodore family, but because of the kind of moral degeneracy and the moral chaos that obtained. And, you know, for instance, Ethel DuPont, whom Franklin Jr. married, came to live briefly in the White House, and the White House maids always talk about her, and this would be in the late 30s, kind of walking around looking distracted and pulling her hair out as you know, she heard rumors of her husband, Franklin Jr., having brought women into the White House itself to be with. And so, you know, it's really a hothouse sort of atmosphere that these Roosevelts inhabited.
On the cover you say Peter Collier with David Horowitz, but inside you write that he has been a full co-author with you before, but this time was not?
Right.
And why?
Well, I guess he had in a way, other fish to fry, and we began the book together, and he had to, you know, move on to other things. He did make a contribution to the book, and you know, he remains my kind of collaborator in life, as it were.
Who is he?
He's a friend of mine who was with me at Ramparts magazine in the old days, and who has, you know, who has had a kind of political odyssey that mine has paralleled somewhat. That is, going out of the left, becoming critics of the new left, and of, to some degree, of the radicalism of the 60s. And we've kind of maintained that position together, and It's just that I'm sure we'll probably write other books together, but this one he was unable to because of other commitments he had to kind of...
Where does he live?
He lives in Los Angeles.
And there's something out called Heterodoxy that he puts out.
Yeah.
Do you have anything to do with that?
I do. We put it out together. It's it's a little publication we do with our left hand, or I guess our right hand in a way, it's a monthly that is a kind of a journal de combat attacking political correctness, which we both take to be one of the truly ominous developments in our culture.
What does heterodoxy mean?
Well, it means basically the opposite of orthodoxy, and that's, I suppose, the point. We're worried about what George Orwell called, rightly I think, the smelly little orthodoxies, referring to socialism and Trotskyism and communism in his day, and I think they really, in a sense, apply to those codes of behavior and the kind of coercive atmosphere that exists, particularly in the American college campus today.
When were you the most liberal in your life?
Well, we didn't call it liberal. We scorned liberals, and in fact, it would be quite inadequate for people looking to look back at the 60s and understand the history of that time to think that people were liberal then. The people that David and I particularly ran with were radicals, if not revolutionaries, and considered the liberals the target. It was never the right that was the target of the radicals in the 60s. It was the liberal center. And it's no accident, obviously, that all those institutions associated with liberalism, the Democratic Party, the university, the media, were the targets of attack by radicals in the 60s.
When were you the most radical?
Probably 1968, 69.
Who'd you vote for in those years?
We didn't vote. Voting was kind of collaboration with the system, was being complicit with the system. You didn't vote. What you did was acted in a way to, as you know, in the obnoxious Marxist cliche of the day, maximize the contradictions and to bring the system down.
Then how would you define your politics today? I mean, you're a member of a party?
Not really. I've always been a registered Democrat, but I would find it hard to vote for the Democratic Party today. And indeed, beginning in 1980, I voted for Ronald Reagan, and I think that was the Reagan presidency, in spite of the fact that it's gotten the abuse that it has. I think it was in a way a great presidency, and this transition that David and I particularly, but others made out of the left and into a position not really of being members of the right so much as being sort of anti-left. I suppose that's what how I would characterize my position, you know, today. It was a long process. It wasn't a kind of a road to Damascus sort of epiphany. It was a process that took 4 or 5 years, and in a way it's like leaving a church. That's what the left is. That's what the semi or fully communist left was, particularly a sort of secular church, and it had all the punishments and disincentives for apostasy that any church has, and so it's very hard to leave.
Of all the books you've written, the Kennedys, the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Fondas, the Roosevelts, which one sold the best?
The Kennedys sold very well, actually. It was a #1 bestseller for about 12 or 13 weeks, and it sold 300,000 copies in hardcover, which is a very good sale. I mean, it's not apocalyptic by today's standards. Rush Limbaugh apparently sold 2.3 million of his last book, but it was something that I never expected to happen to me, actually.
And what do you think this book will do?
I think this book will do well. This is a very good book. I mean, I must say, I think it's the best book that I've ever written, and you know, I suppose people will discount that because I am indeed promoting it, as it were, but this is a really interesting family, and this reads, I think, as one critic said, like one of the old triple-decker novels of the past, one of these family saga novels, because there's so many intriguing characters. You mentioned Theodore Roosevelt Jr. I mean, I would not want to leave here without telling what happened to Theodore Roosevelt Jr. Like all Theodore's sons, he was pushed to the margins by Eleanor and Franklin in the 30s, and he really, in a way, became a kind of reflexive critic of Franklin Eleanor. He saw Franklin, as he put it, the New Deal. He believed Franklin was making himself into, as he put it, an American Mussolini. He just, in a way, rather than kind of guiding his efforts by what he thought, you know, everything was instinctively opposed in a way to what Franklin thought and what Franklin was doing. And Theodore Jr. and to some degree his brothers became the disloyal opposition in a way. They, a lot of the opposition, the New Deal, coalesced around them, and Theodore Jr. particularly spent the 30s really attacking Franklin and Eleanor. He was the kind of the pit bull of the Republican Party during those days, and in fact his mother, his father, Theodore's widow, worried that he was allowing himself simply to become a kind of pawn in their hands. And when war was in the offing, actually, uncharacteristically, given the fact he was Theodore Roosevelt's son, Theodore Jr. Became part of America First, became perhaps the most effective spokesman against the involvement in the European situation. Yet, as one of Theodore Roosevelt's sons, when it became clear to him 4 or 5 months before Pearl Harbor that there was going to be war come what may, he immediately, he's in his mid-50s, he enlists. He had maintained his commission from the time he was in World War I, so he enlisted. He came back in as a general, and he became one of the few fighting generals in the American Army. He fought through North Africa, through Italy, and at the age of 57, with D-Day, on the eve of D-Day, this man, crippled by arthritis, having to use a cane to get around, demanded that President Eisenhower allow him to go ashore. I'm sorry, he was General Eisenhower then. That General Eisenhower allow him to go ashore with the first wave at Utah Beach. He said, you know, my men expected of me. You know, I'm the son of Theodore Roosevelt. And he struggled ashore there on his cane on Utah Beach that morning and stood there on the beach, shuttling his men back and forth to a seawall to protection from German fire, and stood there with the bullets zinging around him, smiling that famous smile of his father's, with, you know, that famous Roosevelt dentition. And General Omar Bradley later said, you know, when asked at the end of this long and illustrious military career what the bravest thing he'd ever seen in his military life was, he said without hesitation, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. at Utah Beach. And Theodore Jr. Got his men together, broke through the German lines, pushed quickly into the inland and into the inland part of France, just rushing to kind of keep a German counterattack from forming, and died a few days after Utah Beach of just exhaustion, heart failure. He'd spent himself to the maximum. And indeed, he found a kind of closeness at the end of his life, as all the Roosevelt boys did, Theodore's boys, with Franklin, who also proved to be that real surrogate son of Theodore that he had always wanted to be. He spent himself too, and he died, you know, as the Roosevelts kind of say among themselves, spending and being spent. And there was kind of a closeness. Another Roosevelt, Theodore's sons, Archibald, died in the war. I mean, was wounded in the war. He was the only man, I think, in the history of the U.S. military to be 100% wounded, war wounded in World War I, and 100% again in World War II. An amazing story.
Another book that we've discussed on this program by Blanche Wiesen Cook, you refer to in your book in a footnote. The issue of whether or not Eleanor Roosevelt was a lesbian. Yeah. What's your take on this?
Well, my take is, I guess you have to say the jury is out. I think that Blanche Cook's book, which I find quite an interesting book in many ways, really kind of overstates the case. It's a kind of, it seems to me a kind of, almost a sort of genital reductionism. That is, I can remember my own grandmother having lady friends, them holding hands, them writing letters of incredible endearment to each other, and she was not a lesbian, and that, you know, lesbianism was not, you know, rife in that generation. I think that Eleanor Roosevelt found a kind of solace, obviously, in these independent-minded women, lesbian friends, whom actually her husband Franklin kind of cynically referred to as her she-males, And she found a kind of solace with them. She found a kind of emotional warmth with them. She was drawn to their independence. But I really think that her children were right. They were asked this question, and you know, her children, in particular her son Elliot, would have, and to some degree James, I think were capable of selling almost any shred of anything sensational about their mother to make money, and they always denied this quite vehemently. And their position was not that, you know, that they were worried about it being, you know, a stigmatizing sort of revelation. Their position was very clear, and that is that this was a woman who was probably incapable of that sort of, she'd been so badly wounded over her life by a succession of people, starting with her father, then her mother-in-law, and her husband. She was really incapable of those sorts of profound kind of physical connections, you know.
You say that Alice, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, was the one that told Eleanor Roosevelt about Lucy Mercer?
Well, there had always been a kind of symmetry between these two girls, Alice and Eleanor. Alice had been sort of semi-orphaned by the death of her mother at her birth, and Eleanor had been semi-orphaned by the death of her father when she was 9 or 10 years old. And they grew up in that same family together, passed around among the Theodore family and the family of his brother Elliot and his two sisters, Bammy and Connie, as they were known in the kind of code names by which this family went. They were all kind of together there, and there's both this competition and this kind of thwarted love existed between Eleanor and Alice. And Alice, all her life, particularly as Eleanor outstripped her, I mean, in some sense, their story together was a story in a way of the tortoise and the hare, because Alice began way, way ahead of her, and then Eleanor gradually kind of overtook her and became a fairly famous newspaper columnist, while Alice's own column was kind of stillborn. You're
talking about while she was First Lady, she had a column.
Before and while, yeah. And Alice was picked up to do a column too, but you know, that incredible wit and vivacity that she had didn't translate itself to the printed page. She could never really quite get her intellectual regimen onto the printed page, even though her publisher would have her do various things to overcome the block, like dictate or talk aloud, and then have the secretary who was taking down the thoughts out of the room so she wasn't seen. It never really worked for Alice, and she saw Eleanor outstrip her, become First Lady, and she never really, there had always been this competition between them, and she always was fairly vicious to Eleanor. She had this imitation she would do of Eleanor, you know, a buck-tooth kind of look with making her chin recede, and she did it in front of all audiences. And in fact, Eleanor sometimes, with this sort of almost self-lacerating quality that she had, would invite her to the White House, and at some point during the evening would say, Alice, don't you think it's time that you did your imitation of me now? And Alice would oblige, do this terribly wounding imitation of her facial kind of inadequacies, and did it on into her 90s, when she was a kind of major society figure still in Washington, one of the original cave dwellers who lived on into the 80s, died in the age of 96, still obsessed with Eleanor. Eleanor was long gone, and as Alice was wandering in senility, she would ask, where's Eleanor? What's Eleanor doing?
When did you start this book?
Oh, I guess about 4 years ago, actually.
Where did you write it?
I wrote it in my home, but where I went to research it, I was, you know, fortunate to get the daughter of Flora Whitney to give me the love letters between her and Quentin, so I went to New York for them. I went to the Library of Congress and saw this remarkable collection of papers I don't think that have ever really been examined with any kind of adequacy that Theodore Roosevelt Jr. left, that really show the arc of his life, how he was the crown prince, how he was displaced by Franklin, and how he spent his afterlife, as it were, and up to Hyde Park, to Harvard, where the Theodore Roosevelt collection exists, one of the truly remarkable kind of manuscript collections, I think, in America, showing really the development of this charismatic, magnetic figure, and showing him kind of coming of age, and all these letters that he wrote to this remarkable brood of children who continued to be his prime preoccupation even when he was in the presidency, writing them sometimes twice a day, each of them, you know, to tell them about doings in the presidency, but to keep them close to him.
Is writing hard for you?
Writing well is hard for me.
How long did it take, once you sat down to write this book, to complete it?
Probably a year and a half, I would say.
And when you write, do you write on a typewriter or?
Typewriter. Gee, that's like chiseling out in stone these days. No, you have to have a word processor now. That's technology that is indispensable. I can remember actually somebody was talking to me about this the other day, sitting, I mean, it seems like a century ago, sitting at a typewriter and, making a couple of mistakes, ripping the paper out, doing this over and over again. My first child, somebody asked him when he went to school what his father did, and he said something about, oh, he types and throws stuff away into the wastebasket. I can't believe we ever tried that.
What's the next book?
I'm not sure. I'd like to do kind of a memoir of the 50s, which I think is a much maligned era. My daughter actually took a course that touched on the 50s in college and learned that it was simply about kind of gray flannel suitism and Aussie and Harrietism and that sort of thing, and Leave It to Beaverism. It's kind of a monochromatic view of the 50s. I'd like to write about the 50s. I think there's one more great American family to do, and that's the Addams family. I said that to my kids, and they got all excited, and then I said, no, I mean John Adams. But that remarkable family that begins with the president, the second president of the United States, and kind of terminates in Henry Adams, arguably the greatest American intellectual.
Of all these people you write about in this book, give me your first, second, and third choices of who you'd like to sit down and actually interview.
Oh, I suppose clearly it would have to be Theodore Roosevelt. He was the greatest, perhaps the greatest interview in American history. I suppose secondly it would have to be Franklin, who was sort of a magician who learned to use words like magician's misdirection elegantly to make people forget his disability. And third, it would have to be Eleanor, one of the truly remarkable women in our time.
This is the book. It's about the Roosevelts, an American saga, and our guest has been Peter Collier. We thank you for joining us.
Thanks for letting me.